disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, allowance is made for fair use purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, education, and research. Fair use as a use permitted it by the copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. I am Afro. Please do me a favor as you enter the room and hit the thumbs up button. Today's video we're going to talk about the truth about Airbnb. So without further ado, we're going to get into this video and let's see what the truth is about these Airbnbs. Shall we? Here we go.
Airbnb should never have worked. The CEO knew nothing about business. The idea had been done before and was actually illegal in many cities. And even the company's founders didn't think it would work. And yet, despite everything, Airbnb has become a billion-dollar company and one of the greatest business success stories of the digital age. They're the largest accommodation provider in the world, yet they don't own any real estate. So, how the hell did they do it? Brian and Joe were on the verge of getting evicted from their apartment. Rent was due and they were broke. However, they knew a popular design conference was coming to town in a few weeks, which meant thousands of people would be descending on the city and hotels would quickly get full.
At that point, we just had this idea. We said, well, designers need a place to stay. We literally have no money. In fact, I don't know how I'm going to make rent. So we thought, what if we just created a bed and breakfast for the design conference?
They had 3 airbeds they could blow up, and so they figured they'd try to charge people to stay at their apartment for the weekend. To advertise this, they created a basic website called Airbed and Breakfast using a free WordPress template. And, unsurprisingly, almost nobody took them seriously. But, since hotels did fill up as expected, Brian and Joe managed to get a few people to pay to stay with them. And, weirdly, it was great. They showed their guests around the city, took them to their favourite restaurants, and everyone had a great time. Brian and Joe made around $1,000 from the 4-day conference, enough to pay their rent, which bought them some extra time to try and come up with their real business idea.
Airbed and breakfast was not the big idea. We thought it would pay the rent. So we had enough time to think of the big idea.
So Brian and Joe began trying to think of what their groundbreaking new business would be, since Airbnb was never meant to be a serious long-term thing. However, whilst trying to come up with new business ideas, Brian spoke to his mum, who was concerned he didn't have a job. "Mum, I'm an entrepreneur," Brian explained, but she just said, "No, you're unemployed." And she was right. Brian and Joe didn't have any groundbreaking new business ideas. So they instead went back to their airbed idea, which had been a lot of fun. And so they figured maybe other people want to make money renting out airbeds in their apartments too. So Brian and Joe recruited their old roommate Nathan, a computer programmer who would help them make a more legitimate and professional looking site, where people could make money renting out airbeds in their apartments. And so they relaunched Airbed and Breakfast, advertising it as a new lodging service for sold out conferences. But most people were very skeptical. In fact, they only got 2 paying customers, one of which was Brian himself. The biggest problem was people didn't want to list their homes. Many people thought the whole thing was some weird social experiment. However, the 3 founders believed that if enough people actually tried it, they'd see it could be a great experience. So when they heard that 75,000 people were coming to the Democratic National Convention, where Obama would be giving a speech, they decided to relaunch Airbnb once again to try and drum up some publicity. And this brings us to weird business lesson number 1 from Brian Chesky.
If you launch and no one notices, you can actually just keep launching. And so we just kept launching. Like, we've launched, and like, people would keep writing about it as if we launched.
And it worked. Right before the conference, they contacted every single blog and journalist they could to tell them about this new service they were launching called Airbed and Breakfast. Because it was quite a quirky idea, some people wrote about what they were doing, which caused some big newspapers to pick the story up as well. Soon, they had so much traffic that their website crashed, and PayPal banned their account for receiving too many payments too quickly, as people rushed to book apartments for the weekend that the conference was happening. But once they got those problems resolved, they were excited. Hundreds of people were listing their rooms on the site, and other people were booking them. They had proof this could actually work. The only problem was that as soon as the conference ended, people stopped booking rooms. They were back to square one with no customers. They needed to find a way to get people using the service all year round, not just at big conferences or events. But they were still very low on cash, so Brian spoke to one of his friends.
He told me that there were these people called angels. And the first thing I thought was, oh my God, this guy's insane, he believes in angels. And he goes, no, they're angel investors.
Brian had never heard of angel investors, but his friend explained to him that they could give him money to help grow the business, in exchange for owning part of the company. And so, Brian set up meetings with different angel investors, which went horribly. One investor they met at a cafe literally just got up halfway through and walked out of the meeting. The big problem was that their idea sounded so risky. Letting people rent out space in their house to total strangers sounded like it would end in disaster. And their business model involved taking just a small transaction fee on each deal. If you heard that investment pitch back in 2008, you probably wouldn't have invested either. So one after another, investors turned Brian down. Little did they know, if they had invested $150,000 back then, which is what Brian was looking for, today their investment would be worth multiple billions of dollars. It was literally one of the greatest investment opportunities, it's just nobody could see that yet. So Brian and Joe had to take on credit card debt instead, just to keep the business afloat. They really felt there was potential with the idea, but seemingly nobody else did. They had a service nobody was using, and it was going to take something incredibly unlikely to save the company.
I mean, when you really think about it, to rent out your house or your apartment to complete strangers it's a risky and dangerous thing to do, because you're not doing, I never did an Airbnb, but I don't think they're doing strenuous things as background checks and things like that on these people that's renting out their homes and apartments. So that can be a risky business to do and a dangerous thing to do. But I mean, it's a great idea, I think, but I don't know. I never been in the Airbnb. I don't know how the shit works. I ain't gonna lie to you, but hope I learned something. Anyway, back to the video.
For me, this is rock bottom. We're totally in debt. We don't know what to do. We're desperate. Late at night, it's midnight, 1 in the morning, and Joe and I think maybe we're airbed and breakfast. The airbeds aren't working out. Maybe we could sell breakfast. I mean, everyone needs to eat.
So, as crazy as it sounds, they decided to focus on the breakfast part of Airbed and Breakfast instead. And in order to capitalize on the upcoming election, they created 2 limited edition cereal brands, Obama O's and Captain McCain's. Brian found a fellow college alumni who had a printing shop, and agreed to print 1,000 cereal boxes for free if they gave him
Okay, now wait a minute. It was cereal out in Obama name. I'm so behind time. Oh my God. I've never known that. I've never seen it in the store. I don't know if it's because I really don't eat cereal, but I never even heard people around me even talk about those kind of cereal. That existed? Wow, I didn't know that. I did not know that. But okay. Anything's possible to nowadays. Back to the video.
cut of the sales. Brian and Joe then went through every local supermarket to try and find the cheapest cereal they could, and then bought 1,000 boxes of it, so they could put it into their new designer packaging. Back in their kitchen, they got to work, hand-folding the cereal boxes and gluing them shut. Brian remembers thinking to himself that Mark Zuckerberg had never had to burn his hands hot gluing cereal boxes to launch his company, so the fact they were having to do this probably wasn't a good sign. But believe it or not, this weird cereal gimmick actually worked. They sent some of these cereal boxes to journalists who inevitably wrote about them, and people started buying the boxes for ridiculously high prices because they branded them as rare collectible items. As a result, they ended up getting national media attention and even mentioned on CNN.
Joe Gebbia and Brian Chesky. They had created a website, airbedandbreakfast.com, to connect convention goers at both conventions looking for a cheap place to stay with residents who had space on their couch or an extra room. Well, now the team has made another contribution, as you can see here, to the presidential campaign with partisan cereals Obama O's and Cap'n McCain's.
Obama O's sold out within 3 days, and people even started reselling them on eBay and Craigslist for up to $350 a box. The cereal had been a huge short-term success. Brian and Joe made somewhere between $20,000 to $30,000 from it.
They fucking with my brain, right? This can't be right. $350 per box of Obama O's and the other one, McCain O or something. $350 for a box of god darn cereal. Y'all got to be kidding me. And it worked? I ain't got nothing to say about that. I'm flabbergasted. Back to the video. This is fucking alarming and disgusting. And you got people out here starving and hungry. And y'all sitting here spending money. $350 on a box of cereal. Let me get back into this video before I start saying some stuff.
Which allowed them to pay off their credit card debts. But people started asking them, wait, so are you a cereal company now? Brian didn't even know how to answer that. The truth was that they still had no customers for their actual Airbnb business. The cereal box idea had helped them clear their debts, but that was it. They were simply back to $0 now, right where they started. And selling cereal had only worked because it was limited edition. They couldn't just keep making more. In fact, they hadn't quite sold out of the Cap'n McCain boxes, which meant Brian and Joe mostly lived off dry cereal for the next few months, because they literally had no money to buy other food. Brian would wake up anxious every morning with his heart pounding. They really believed there was potential with the airbed idea, but they needed money and help. And that's when they heard Y Combinator was accepting applications, a startup accelerator that invests in new companies and offers them guidance from experienced entrepreneurs. Brian and Joe eagerly applied and went in for an interview. Unfortunately, just like all their other meetings with investors, it was a disaster. The interviewer asked, why would anyone want to stay in some stranger's house? And why would anyone want to invite a stranger into their house in the first place? Brian and Joe got up to leave the meeting, already knowing they weren't going to get accepted. Getting into Y Combinator had been their last shot, and now it was over. The company was dead. As they were walking out the meeting, Joe pulled a box of Cap'n McCain cereal out of his bag and handed it to the Y Combinator interviewer, who was understandably confused. Joe explained they'd made these to raise money and get out of debt. Wow, the interviewer said, bemused and impressed after hearing the cereal story. You guys are like cockroaches. You just won't die. Brian and Joe left the meeting and before long got a call. Y Combinator was going to take a chance on them. They'd invest in Airbnb and help them try to make the business work. Brian was shocked. The interview had not gone well. But he later found out that it was the cereal that had changed their minds. They said, if you can convince people to pay $40 for some cheap cereal, maybe you can convince people to sleep in other people's airbeds. This is actually a common theme with investors. They're often investing in the founders themselves rather than the idea. Ideas.
All right, so I stand corrected. Maybe I got that wrong. I thought they sold a box of cereal for $350. So no, they sold a box of cereal for $40. I think that's what I heard. So I stand corrected on that. I don't give a damn. It's still ridiculous to spend $40 on a box of cereal. It's ridiculous to spend $10 on a box of cereal. Back to the video, y'all.
Can be pivoted along the way, but that out-of-the-box thinking and drive to succeed no matter what, that's something worth investing in.
And I remember calling my mom like, "Mom, I'm a cockroach, I got in." So that's how we got into Y Combinator, and that kind of was a turning point for us.
Very soon after getting into Y Combinator, other investors started pouring money into Airbnb as well. Suddenly, they had access to funding, as well as access to experts who could help them run the business. The founders were ecstatic. It looked like Air Bed and Breakfast finally had a chance of succeeding. Little did they know, they were about to build one of the fastest growing startups in history. Shortly after joining Y Combinator, the Airbnb founders had a huge revelation. They'd been thinking way too small. At the time, their service was called Air Bed and Breakfast, and their rules stated that you specifically had to rent out an air mattress, even if you had an actual bed to spare. Not just that, but the host had to be present at the house so they could provide breakfast. So they finally decided to get rid of all these restrictions and shorten their name to simply Airbnb, and almost immediately, demand increased. Another key realization was that users were terrible at taking nice photos of their apartments. So Airbnb agreed to send out professional photographers to help people take better pictures of their homes, which was expensive for Airbnb, but it paid off massively. Bookings for properties soared once the photo quality increased. 50 bookings a day, 100 bookings a day, 1,000 bookings a day. Momentum was building fast. They even started getting quirky listings, like you could stay in a treehouse, a castle, or even an igloo. And this helps explain why Airbnb suddenly started to take off. Many people had become tired of the mass commodification of hotels, where every single one looks the same. For example, you could be staying in Egypt, and it would look identical to a hotel room in your own country. And yet, people craved that authentic experience. They wanted to fully experience the country's unique culture and live like a local. And Airbnb allowed them to quite literally live like a local. Rather than just staying in busy tourist areas, you could move into a local's home. And sometimes they'd be there as well to tell you about the city. Now, when discussing Airbnb, some people point out that the idea of short-term rentals wasn't actually new. There were sites like Couchsurfing, HomeAway, and even Craigslist. But another one of the key reasons for Airbnb's success was that they focused on making the whole process much more user-friendly. Airbnb worked hard to make the design more sleek and modern, so it felt more professional. And they also focused a lot on their review system, where both the host and the guest would review each other to make the site feel more trustworthy. Airbnb then poached customers straight from their competitors. They created software to automatically email anyone who posted their property on Craigslist, asking them if they wanted to list it on Airbnb as well. Plus, Airbnb's timing was perfect. They launched right after the 2008 recession, when lots more people wanted a way to make some extra money by renting out spare space. And travelers wanted cheaper places to stay, so Airbnb simply matched these two groups together. Airbnb also invested heavily in technology. For example, using machine learning and AI to match people to the most relevant listings based on their own tastes and booking patterns. They also built an extremely robust payment system to manage payments between buyers and sellers without relying on a third party, thus making Airbnb's platform a fully self-contained system, which again felt more secure. But the biggest reason of all for Airbnb's sudden rapid growth is that Airbnb has truly global network effects, meaning the more people who list their place on Airbnb, the better the platform becomes to anyone who wants to travel. And of course, more travelers using the site leads to more people wanting to list their home there, so you start getting this exponential growth. And once Airbnb had their system built, it was very cheap and easy for Airbnb to expand into other countries, as the same platform could be used everywhere in the world. For most businesses, expanding into a new city would require huge costs, but not for Airbnb, because they didn't have to own any property themselves. So, with all of these things combined, Airbnb had stumbled onto a winning formula, which caused even more investors to put money in to help the business grow faster. Of course, there were still some who were skeptical of Airbnb. They felt strangers opening their homes to other strangers was surely going to end in disaster. Surely people's houses would get trashed or their belongings stolen. But I'm pleased to tell you that Airbnb is proof of how great humanity can be, because even all these years later, there has never been a major incident. Just kidding, this isn't a Disney movie, so brace yourself. Things are about to get dark.
Well, like I said, it sounds like a very good business to get into, but it also, at the same token, could be very dangerous and harmful. I mean, you got people trashing up the place and just, you can even, get an Airbnb and just do illegal shit like selling guns and selling drugs and prostitution and, all of that stuff like that. Just all kinds of crazy stuff. But let me see how bad this gets. So, back to the video.
EJ was a freelancer who decided to rent out her apartment on Airbnb while she went away on a trip. Her income as a freelancer was inconsistent, and so after hearing people rave about Airbnb, she was keen to try it herself to help cover her bills. EJ listed her home on the platform and described it as her own private retreat. Sunny, bright, cozy, the place in her life that was peaceful and safe. However, when she returned from her trip, her home had been destroyed. The Airbnb guests who had stayed there had completely trashed everything. EJ was heartbroken. She wrote on her blog how the guests had even smashed a hole through a locked closet door and found her passport, cash, credit card, and grandmother's jewelry hidden inside. They took her camera, iPod, laptop, an external backup drive filled with photos and journals. Her entire life. They burned many of her possessions in the fireplace and left ash all over the room. Her furniture, counters, bed, and printer had been doused in powdered bleach. Her clothes were left in a wet, mildewing pile on the floor. So much had either been stolen or broken beyond repair. EJ felt violated, terrified, and could no longer live in her home. She wrote on her blog that she was now suffering from regular panic attacks and spending her afternoons looking through pawn shops to try and find some of her personal belongings that had been taken. But she said the thieves had stolen something that couldn't be replaced: her spirit. EJ's post was soon picked up by multiple news sites, and it went viral. At the Airbnb offices, the team had no idea what to do. Some felt they should admit that it was their fault and try to publicly make amends, but others worried that admitting responsibility would open them up to all kinds of liability in the future. Airbnb's legal team urged Brian to be extremely careful about what he said and try to deal with the matter privately and quietly. Initially, Airbnb was slow to react at all and released quite a generic statement saying they'd been in close contact with EJ, which she later said wasn't really true. The backlash against Airbnb got bigger. Brian couldn't sleep. His chest constantly felt tight. He didn't know what to do. So he ignored all the legal advice he'd been given, sat at his laptop, and simply wrote what he really felt. He began with, Brian went on to say that Airbnb had let EJ down and announced a $50,000 guarantee protecting hosts against damage, effective retroactively as well, meaning EJ would be fully reimbursed with lots of extra compensation on top as well. He announced a 24-hour customer hotline and said they were doubling customer support. These changes would be incredibly expensive, but it was a defining moment. Airbnb was going to fully support its hosts and tried to go above and beyond what was required. In the long run, backing hosts like this was crucial for Airbnb's success, and so the gamble paid off. Unfortunately, just as one crisis got solved, an even bigger one was just beginning.
All right, let's get to the heart of the problem, though, regulation.
Yeah,
So you're having some issues in every major city.
It turns out that the whole idea of Airbnb, renting out your home on a short-term basis, broke the law in many places. And it can completely vary in different countries, cities, and even towns, as everywhere has slightly different local laws around rentals, building code standards, tax collection, and more. Now, in many places, Airbnb worked with regulators to find a solution so they could operate legally. But in some places, it wasn't that simple.
There's a massively powerful hotel industry in New York and hotel unions that have really galvanized people and created this kind of perpetual battle.
New York is just one example of a very high-profile city where Airbnb has faced huge opposition and restrictions. Another was Berlin, where in 2016 it became illegal to rent entire homes and apartments for short periods, and citizens were asked to anonymously report rule-breaking users who were using services like Airbnb. However, part of the reason Airbnb has faced a lot of pushback in some cities is that the people who profit most from Airbnb are not locals wanting to make a little extra cash renting their apartment out, but instead private landlords with multiple multiple properties, because you could make much more money selling a couple of nights at a time on Airbnb than you can renting out a property to one single tenant for several years. But because of this, many feel Airbnb has removed housing from the market for long-term renters, driving up rent prices even further. Some locals feel they can't afford to live in their own city anymore and blame Airbnb for that. Data from AirDNA showed that of the 1.1 million Airbnb listings in the US, around 600,000 are from hosts that have at least 2 other listings. And the top hosts have anywhere from 9 to 272 different listings. There's one single user who raked in $6.8 million via Airbnb. And so the bigger Airbnb got, the more the conflicts grew. Many landlords were very unhappy with their tenants subleasing and started specifically banning Airbnb guests. In some cases, they added cameras to try and catch tenants who were renting out their home, and as a result, some Airbnb hosts started telling guests to pretend they were relatives who were visiting instead of paying guests. It was a constant ongoing battle, and in 2016, Airbnb actually sued New York City and San Francisco because of new legislation they introduced that imposed big fines for both Airbnb and its hosts if they posted listings that violated the short-term rental laws. However, in 2015, Brian stood on stage at a company-wide meeting and told everyone that what would kill Airbnb was not regulators or competition, it was losing their ability to be crazy, to try new and exciting ideas. Brian had studied successful companies like Amazon and Apple and concluded that to achieve long-term success, they needed to branch out into new markets. Brian decided he wanted Airbnb to play a bigger role in people's trips, and thus they launched the Experience Marketplace, a new feature of their site where hosts with a particular skill could offer different experiences to guests. Like, you can meditate with a Buddhist monk, you could have afternoon tea on an alpaca farm, go on a spooky late night walking tour, or even have an expert fire spinner teach you the art of firebending. The idea was to offer authentic travel experiences from real locals. And after the feature launched, some hosts started earning more money from offering these experiences than they did from actually renting out their rooms on Airbnb. The plan seemed to be going well, and Brian said in future he wanted Airbnb to be involved in every aspect of a person's trip. Meaning with Airbnb you would book restaurant reservations, tickets, and lots more, all via Airbnb's app. But then, suddenly, everything changed.
A SARS-like virus, which has infected hundreds in China, has now reached the United States.
COVID crisis has impacted so many industries this year as the virus forced businesses across the country to close their doors.
So overnight, Airbnb went from being the Silicon Valley unicorn to business that is in distress.
Bookings in Europe alone went down 80%.
What Airbnb will look like after the coronavirus pandemic, or whether the company will survive at all.
If there's one business model you really don't want in a pandemic, it's a business model built around people traveling to new places and staying in strangers' homes. In fact, many started calling it the Airbnb apocalypse.
We got more than $1 billion of cancellations by guests, requested cancellations. So what happened is the pandemic hits, people can't travel, and a whole bunch of people cancel, right? Because they have cancellation policies. There were about $1 billion of requested cancellations, but the host wouldn't let them cancel. So we had to make a decision. Do we override the host cancellation policy or not?
It was an incredibly difficult situation where guests wanted refunds, but hosts didn't want to cancel and lose their money. Eventually, Airbnb sided with guests and let people cancel, since they figured from a health and safety standpoint, this was the best option. But of course, Airbnb hosts felt betrayed by this. So in response, Airbnb created a $250 million fund to give away to Airbnb hosts to help cover some of their lost revenue. For Airbnb, giving away this much money was certainly not ideal, since they were barely making any money themselves now that people weren't traveling. They'd lost 80% of their expected business because of COVID. So it was time for a drastic change.
So we pivoted the entire company to nearby travel.
Basically, because international travel was mostly restricted, the new plan was to focus on people wanting to rent somewhere nearby. And since a lot of people during COVID were desperate to get out of their own home, Airbnb saw a huge increase in new bookings once they started focusing on nearby listings instead. So whilst many thought the pandemic could really crush Airbnb, it was really the hosts who suffered more. In particular, the ones with multiple properties that were just sat completely empty during lockdowns. Sure, Airbnb lost out on some booking fees, but they weren't paying any maintenance costs on empty properties because they don't own the properties. However, whilst in many ways Airbnb's business model is brilliant, some are still wondering if it's actually sustainable long term. Because Airbnb has yet to report an annual profit since Brian and Joe launched the company 12 years ago. In fact, it's been warned they may never be profitable. So, whilst Airbnb have managed to survive so many challenges, from homes getting destroyed, to legal battles, to a global pandemic, and so many more controversies, some wonder if the biggest problem of all for Airbnb is simply that their core business model might not be profitable. The truth is, that still remains to be seen. But what is undeniable is that Airbnb is a modern day rags to riches story. It's quite amazing when you stop to think about it. Airbnb exists because two guys couldn't afford to pay their rent. Even Brian himself admitted the whole idea was a weird 1 in a million shot that pretty much nobody except his granddad thought was a good idea. And yet, him and his two co-founders somehow built this giant global company. Brian was even named as an ambassador of global entrepreneurship by Obama, which was a bizarre full circle moment, given that Brian only managed to save Airbnb by making Obama-themed cereal to raise money to pay off his credit card debts. Very few companies have seen such rapid growth as Airbnb, although there is one company that comes to mind that's even more controversial than Airbnb, which is ByteDance, the Chinese company who created TikTok. If you want to watch my video on the story of ByteDance and TikTok, you can check that out by clicking right here. But first, I want to tell you about our video sponsor, Brilliant.org. Brilliant's philosophy is that learning shouldn't be about sitting in boring lectures and memorizing information for a test. It should be about actually solving practical problems yourself, which is a much better and more fun way to learn. That's why Brilliant have an extensive catalogue of interactive courses to help you learn a wide variety of STEM subjects and other incredibly useful skills, including software development, statistics and finance, engineering, and many, many more. You can just pick any course you're interested in and get started at your own pace. A great example is their statistics course that helps you learn how to make the best decisions when you have limited information, a skill that's incredibly helpful not just in business, but in all areas of life. So if you'd like to try out Brilliant for free, click the link in the description below or visit brilliant.org/magnates, and the first 200 people get 20% off an annual membership. Thanks for watching to the end of this video. You are a legend, and I'll see you soon. Cheers.
Well, I hope y'all liked that video. I've learned some things, but not really. You know, this is Airbnb. Like I said, it's a good thing that they came up with this, and I think they said that they were illegals. I think they were that created Airbnb. But I mean, the idea was a good idea, but all of this tragedy and stuff that they had to go through, you know, it's crazy. But hey, but anyway, thank you for stopping in. Please like and share my video, and look for more reaction videos to come. So everybody be safe out there. Until next time, peace, and I'm out.